Καλημέρα σε αυτούς που έρχονται τώρα. Ευχαριστώ αυτούς που είναι πιστοί και ήταν και στην προηγούμενη συνεδρίαση. Όπως εξήγησα, έχουμε 3 συνεδριάσεις, την προηγούμενη, αυτή και την επόμενη, που καλύπτουν το ίδιο θέμα, δηλαδή ένα βασικό θεσμό του ΟΣΑ, που είναι το Global Strategy Group, που προσπαθεί να διερευνήσει μελλοντικές τάσεις, να προσφέρει μια πιο στρατηγική θεώρηση στην προβληματική του ΟΣΑ και ταυτόχρονα συζητάμε σήμερα και για την θεματική της τελευταίας συνεδρίασης του Global Strategy Group, η οποία έγινε τον περασμένο Δεκέμβριο υπό την προεδρία του Κυριάκου Πιερακάκη και που το θέμα ήταν η τηλεεργασία και η τηλεεκπαίδευση. Στην προηγούμενη συνεδρίαση καλύψαμε τα θέματα της τηλεεκπαίδευσης και την επίδραση της τηλεεργασίας και της τηλεεκπαίδευσης στο γεωγραφικό χώρο, στις πόλεις μας, στις περιφέρειες. Η συνεδρίαση αυτή θα αγγίξει 2 άλλες θεματικές. Αφενός την οικονομική διάσταση, την στάση των επιχειρήσεων, πώς αντιμετωπίζουν την δυνατότητα αυτή οι εργαζόμενοι τους να εργάζονται εξ αποστάσεως και κατόπιν φυσικά τη διάσταση την κοινωνική, τι κοινωνικές συνέπειες έχει η τηλεεργασία. Θα ξεκινήσουμε με τον Luiz de Mello, ο οποίος είναι διευθυντής στη Διεύθυνση της Οικονομίας του ΟΣΑ, για την πρώτη θεματική. Luiz, you have the floor. If you can limit yourself to about 7 minutes, so that we have some time afterwards for discussion.
Perfect. Thank you very much, George. Thanks for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here in this beautiful city and to be part of this forum. And thanks also, George, for the leadership of Greece in the Global Strategy Group. It was a great opportunity to raise the issues that we are talking about today among OECD countries and to come up with some insights for policy that can guide the action of our government moving forward. I would like, George, to make basically 3 points about what we have learned so far about remote work. One is that, as you put it in the previous panel, this is not a new trend. This is a trend that has been really accelerated by the pandemic. People who already worked remotely in many of our countries, but for much less in terms of the share of their working time, and let's say, in very different setups than what we had prompted by the pandemic. The pandemic was really a natural experiment in that sense, that it forced all of us, all of a sudden, to adapt to this new reality. So what have we learned since the beginning of the pandemic? One is that, and also it came up in the previous panel, that it's something that is restricted to a subclass, let's say, of workers. It's essentially white-collar workers working in knowledge-intensive sectors of our economy. And it's also people who live in countries, in cities, in areas where there is access to ICT technologies, to broadband connection, to the technological means to access the technologies basically that are needed for remote work. And also people who had the skills to do that. So it's a combination of basically a number of things. One is the ability of the technology to do that. The other one is the skills that allow you to make the most of it. And then the other question that then comes up is this a trend that is here to stay? So we looked at a number of indicators there. One is, what was the actual take-up of telework among our firms, among our workers? And were people satisfied with what they had? And then it was interesting, we conducted a survey last year in the context of the Global Forum on Productivity of the OECD, with a very large number of firms, so managers and employees across the OECD area. And it was what came out of that is that both managers and workers were fairly satisfied overall with the experience of telework. All of them said that they were happy to do that, ideally 2-3 days per week, so not 0 as most people were used to before, not full-time permanently, as some people thought might be a trend at the beginning. And we know the reasons why. People needed the interactions, people needed the physical presence in the office, people needed the contact with their colleagues. But also what came out in the survey is that there are lots of conditions for that to work well. Conditions of, for instance, coordination of schedules, conditions about availability of training, adjustment for both managers and workers to cope with the new reality, and availability of technologies, again. So an issue that comes up all the time as an enabling factor for remote work. And then we asked ourselves, is it the trend that we are seeing, one that is likely to remain over time? So we started looking at that point in time at job offers, job postings, not the exact number of people or exact number of jobs that were subject to telework, but what firms were actually demanding in terms of their ads, in terms of their vacancies. So we started basically looking at job ads on the internet. And it was very interesting to see that, unsurprisingly, when government started imposing restrictions on mobility, stay-at-home regulations, basically confinement policies, the number of job ads for remote work just skyrocketed. Not a surprise. Firms needed to hire workers. They had to do that because there was no other way around it. But what was interesting to see was that as governments started lifting those restrictions, the number of job ads as a share of total job ads remained. So that's a signal, or a sign if you want, that the market has adjusted to that. So there is a certain optimal amount, let's say, of jobs that firms and workers will want to continue to do remotely, given the experience that they had, which was rather positive overall, during the initial phase of the pandemic. So it's still early to tell, but everything points to some permanence in what happened that was triggered by the pandemic. So the immediate question to that is, how does that affect performance? And that was the question that you raised at the beginning, George. So what we saw is that if you compare the productivity of firms, so labor productivity, so it's the, let's say, the most basic concept of economic performance, what we see on the basis of the experience so far is that there tends to be a peak in productivity depending on the intensity of remote work. According to our calculations, a share of remote work around 2 days per week, 1 to 2 days, that corresponds to the peak in productivity. Beyond that, there tends to be a reduction in productivity. And why is that? Again, the loss of contact, the loss of those agglomeration effects, those network effects that are so important to drive knowledge. And we know that what drives productivity in our economies is knowledge creation. It's those knowledge-intensive sectors that drive productivity growth. And they tend to lose if we lose this ability to interact, if we lose the contact, if we lose the ability to create firm-specific capital, which is so important in those sectors that drive productivity growth. So the message there is not so much how many days per week, because that's a statistical question, but it's more conceptually to see what could be the optimal share that our economies will gravitate towards as we emerge from the pandemic and as we learn to live in this new reality. And then I'll conclude here, George, with another thought, which is, well, we are at the OECD, so ultimately we want to know about implications for policy. And here there are, I think, 3 lessons that we need to bear in mind. One is that the policymakers need to create an enabling environment. By that is essentially the point, going back to allowing, making easy access, providing remote technologies, remote or broadband connection, all those connectivity issues that allow people to work remotely if they so wish. So enabling is one. Training is another aspect. Training, retraining, making sure that the population has the skills that are needed for that. So together with enabling, it's basically, let's say, empowering people to make the most of remote work. And that really revolves around equipping them with the competencies, with the skills that they need to thrive in this new environment. And there is a third element that I think is very important to mention, which is to protect workers. After all, working from home is very different from working in the regular, normal workplace. So there has to be some adjustment to legislation, to regulations, so that there is a balance between working life and private life. What we saw at the beginning of the pandemic is that that line was blurred. So people were working weekends, long hours, because basically you were at home, you couldn't go out, so everything became part of the same reality. So we need to make sure that that is regulated, that people have the right to disconnect. One important element that we talked about a lot in the early days of the pandemic was precisely this, the right to disconnect, to make sure that you are available, but within bounds that are consistent with normal working conditions. The other one is everything that has to do with working from home. What about, if you're working from home, it's your electricity that you're paying for that you are using. It's your equipment that is depreciating because you are working from home. So how do you create this balance of costs, if you want, and benefits between employers and employees as we go ahead? Issues related to insurance. Nowadays, in most of our economies, we have very well codified health and safety regulations for the workplace. But we don't have that when people are working from home. So how can we make sure that the whole, let's say, institutional framework around remote work is there, that workers know about it, so that there are campaigns to raise awareness about all that, so that people can again thrive, both as human beings, as professionals in this new environment, and that the economy can benefit at the same time. So looking at it, and George, I think probably I've extended my time here, but what can we do collectively to learn from the experience, make sure that we create the conditions to do as well as we can moving forward, so that our economies perform and people remain with the levels of satisfactions that we have seen, at least on the base of a service. Thank you, George.
Thank you very much, Luiz. The next speaker is going to be Leonidas Christopoulos. With Leonidas, we have worked together, and with his minister, Kyriakos Pierakakis, for the GSG. So he has been very much involved in our effort, contributing the leadership for the GSG. So if you would like to continue, comment on the same line with Luiz.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Luiz, for these excellent comments. Indeed, we have worked in the framework of the GSG on the issue of teleworking and the impact on the economy. Well, I had prepared some notes, but I think that I'm going to be very, very brief in my remarks. Because what I think we're facing right now globally is not something new, as you already mentioned. It has been around. At least in Greece, I know that, especially in the public sector, teleworking existed even 10 years ago, and we already had included teleworking, at least in the public sector, in our manifesto before the elections, in order to implement it after the election. So yes, there was a trend. Yes, it already existed, but certainly the pandemic put more light on the issue and made it a big trend and opened up a discussion around rights, around what the enabling environment should be. But I still think that we're in a learning process. Even if we have passed laws, and Greece has passed 2 laws, the Ministry of Labor has passed one for the private sector. The Ministry of Interior has passed another one for the public sector. And we are trying to improve infrastructure, improve connectivity in order to create this enabling environment. However, we're still in a learning process. And I think that policymakers around the globe and in Greece, even if they pass laws, as they said, will still be trying to understand what needs to be done in order for teleworking to become, let's say, a sustainable working environment for workers. Now, as you mentioned, of course, there are great, let's say, benefits and attractions from teleworking for both workers and state and businesses. As you said, it increases productivity up to one point, but then it becomes negative. And of course, there are cons as well, like, and we've experienced it, at least in our working environments, in the ministries, we've experienced that what started off as something new, and the civil servants wanted to stay at home and telework, at a certain point they started wanting to come back to work. They started wanting to be able to see each other, to communicate with each other, rather than do it from home. So yes, there are pros and cons on the issue. Now, as I said, as a Ministry of Digital Governance, we're trying to understand the environment in which teleworking should go. Of course, there are competent ministries that actually assess these environments and try to understand the mega trend and where the issue is going. We're trying to create this enabling environment. We're trying to improve the infrastructure, the connectivity issues around teleworking. We know that we already attract people like digital nomads, for example, who want to come and work from Greece and work for their firms abroad. And we also focus a lot on the issue of digital skills, because I think that is one of the main pillars that people need to have, the reskilling and upskilling agenda, in order to be able to telework, not only because they need to know how to use the systems, the IT equipment and everything, but also because they need to understand and feel safe in using these systems, because there is always a level, I think, of uncertainty when you're an employee and you want to work from home and you need to work from several systems that the employer provides for you, but you're always, if you don't have the necessary digital skills, if you don't have the necessary familiarization with those systems, you might feel a bit unsafe using them from home. So that is another issue that I think you pointed out regarding awareness and regarding understanding the whole system. In my opinion, we need to focus a lot, policymakers need to focus a lot on the reskilling and upskilling agenda for employees, and on the awareness agenda. They need to understand that it's a trend that is going to continue. It has its benefits, they have their rights, but we're still in a learning process, and we will improve this trend as time goes by. So with that said, I think I'm going to stop here so Domna can continue. We can have a discussion later.
Well, the other issue that has been mentioned and which is fundamental is the social dimension, what it means, this change of the working environment, what it means for the workers, what it means for the social dimension. And we have the pleasure to have with us the Deputy Minister of Labor and Social Affairs, Domna Michailidou, to make us understand what are the possible approaches to this issue, and also what is the approach of the Greek ministry.
Thank you, George. Thank you very much for this, and thank you all for being here this morning. I'll start with something that both Luiz and Leonidas mentioned before. The fact that remote working was here before, and it was here before in Greece as well. However, I think a distinct feature of teleworking and remote working in Greece vis-à-vis the rest of the EU is that there was in Greece an asymmetric jump. So in Greece, we started, let's say the data that I have are from 2019, we started from a 5% of the population working remotely, and this increased in a five-fold way. So now from 5, we were to 26% of the population working remotely, while the equivalent gap or the equivalent jump in the rest of the countries of the European Union was a twofold jump. So they started from, if I'm not mistaken, from a 16%, and now they are at a 37%, a bit more than a twofold jump. So yes, it is something that was happening before, but in Greece, it's something which has increased to a considerable factor. So the question there is, as Luiz mentioned, if this is a trend which seems to persist, which seems to be staying here, what are we doing? Are there any social dimensions to it? Are there growing inequalities? Are there growing social cleavages with regards to what we do with remote working being a permanent feature of our employment markets? And there, I think that, as many things in life, it's again a double-edged sword. And I'm afraid that in this case, the one edge is sharper than the other. And what do I mean by that? That, of course, what do you see with social inequalities? Who do you try to capture first? The most vulnerable. Who are the most vulnerable? The ones with the lowest disposable income, the disabled, the large families, the single-parented families. So what are the trends? Are there any trends that we can observe from now for the most vulnerable? And what do we see there? And why is it a double-edged sword with two edges? The positive one is that the most vulnerable, i.e. the disabled, or i.e. the ones with the lowest income, do have lower costs now of accessing their employment market where this exists. And this caveat of where this exists is quite a big caveat. And what do I mean by that? The fact that it's easier if a person with disability has a place in the employment market, it's easier for him to practice his job from home rather than go there. Equally with someone who is from lower income and doesn't have to acquire all the transportation costs of reaching his actual job. However, the other side of the coin, the other edge of the sword, is the one which I'm afraid points towards larger social inequalities. And this is where, as Leonidas said, the role of reskilling and upskilling is quite pivotal to what we do here. So the other edge is the one of the disabled people needing to socialize, the disabled people needing to engage into independent living in order to be able to fully integrate into the labor and also the labor market and also the society. It's the side of the family that if the female of the household predominantly stays at home, she will need to take care of the dependees, either the children or the elderly, that otherwise someone else would have been. So she loses all these positive effect of socializing. It is the angle of the lower skilled workers where we see again an asymmetry of manual working, of course, being able to digitize itself. So what do you do there? Do you reskill them or do you try to shrink this side of your economy? And up to which stage the manual, the blue collar, if you want, employment sector of your economy can be responsive, can be elastic to such kind of digitization changes. So there are quite a lot of variables, there are quite a lot of factors that affect and pertain to the most vulnerable elements within a society that actually have a social impact, have a social angle that we need to stress and we need to investigate and we need to see what do we do with them. Do we try to create a third route of a mixed employment model, one in which remote working would only occupy a certain percentage? What do we do with digital illiteracy? In Greece, digital illiteracy is at 29%. How do you skill, how do you help these people in order to step up in the ladder of the employment market? So it's a discussion which is still unfortunately premature. However, it is a discussion that has accelerated geometrically within the pandemic, as many things did within these 3 years almost now, a bit less. So there are questions that within the ministry we are trying to reply to. We have included 1 billion euros within the Recovery and Resilience Fund in order to skill, especially the most vulnerable, especially the structurally unemployed, especially the long-term unemployed, but still there are things to do, policies to be implemented and be designed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think with those three introductory talks, we have a certain perception that the COVID has accelerated the trend, and that we find ourselves in a new situation where part of the work is going to be remote. Now, there is one other issue that I would like to raise. Of course, this appreciation is with a certain, I would say, situation in the field of infrastructures and technology. I mean, we have tried to use whatever was available. Very often the infrastructure was insufficient, and we have all suffered from Zoom sessions during which the connection stopped. But there is another issue as well. It is that the technology we're using is kind of primitive. It is evolving. We have seen that how Zoom, for example, has evolved, I mean, to become more sophisticated. But one can imagine that there is a great demand from the market to innovate, and one can anticipate tremendous changes in the technology from this primitive situation where we have an image that is unstable. We ourselves do not know very well how to treat our image. We can imagine a situation in 1, 2, 3 years where we will have 3-dimensional images, better sound, and an environment in which the simulation of physical communication will be much stronger. This is one issue. The other issue is the idea of clusters where people work together, close to their houses, to their homes, each one working with another employer eventually, so that you have the advantage of overcoming distance, but at the same time you have the social context that helps you not to feel too alienated. So maybe this appreciation that we have will change because of the normal technological evolution that will arrive, and is the adaptation to new opportunities. I don't know if you want to comment on that, and who would like to take the floor?
I think Leonidas might be the most suitable here.
He's the most technologically...
Well, just a couple of remarks. First of all, there's no normal technological evolution anymore. We are in a situation where technology is running in a pace that we've never seen before. In that sense, I don't think that there were primitive systems. Of course, technology improves, connectivity improves, the infrastructure will improve. It already improves. But I think that the whole discussion regarding remote working, at one point, and because it has opened up very much, at one point it will become a discussion of how can I make these platforms and these tools that I have in order to be able to work from home, in order to make a Zoom call or a remote, more friendly to the employees. I mean, you had probably a platform a few years ago that a few people could use and could operate, and now because it is being used by everybody, it will become more friendly, the environment, the procedures will be more friendly on how to use these platforms, and probably at one point, and I don't think it will be very far down the road, you'll see a meta environment where your avatar can actually meet with people from your workspace, and they can do a meeting in a meta environment. And I think it's very close in the future. So I think on the issue of technology and of infrastructure, there's not a big issue there. It's an issue of making it more friendly to the people who are not very much familiarized with this type of work.
Yes, but the question is, if we have this meta environment, will that lead to a different balance between the time that we work remotely and the time that work physically? I mean, if the conditions are better, maybe the remote time will become more important. This is the question. In comparison to what we evaluate today, and how much the environment can become more user-friendly to change this balance.
Well, I think,
okay.
I think the problem, I'm not sure if this works. Okay, it works now. I think one of the problems is that if the environment becomes overly friendly, then the power of the regulator to secure and safeguard the well-being of the employee is going to be even harder. I mean, it's a challenge that we face now, especially in the Ministry of Labour, how to ensure and make sure that the best interest of the employee is respected. It was a challenge that we faced, and I think it was also a challenge that employers faced themselves, not just, you know, the employees with their own very rights. It's a challenge that the smoother you make the environment of the employee to work remotely, the less frictions you include, the more interconnectivities you have with either parts of the market that he needs, then the harder it is to regulate the market and regulate it in order to safeguard the best interest of the employee. So there's a very smooth and fine tuning in how one needs to approach the whole issue. Sure. And this is where remote working and the environment of remote working also has to do with the flexibility of the employee's time, but also his flexibility to define in which hours he's going to be working, not to define the spectrum of the hours he's going to be working. Because what we saw and what we observed several times was that the spectrum was not used as a spectrum, but it was used as a totality, right?
Luiz?
Yeah, George, I think that's a very interesting point that you raised, and I wanted to just follow up on what you mentioned, Leonidas, about how the technology is changing, you know, because we are shaping how technologies will evolve in this area. So far, we've been focusing essentially on the communication aspect of it, right? We're talking about all these platforms. We are focusing on who we can see, the quality of the image, how we can access, how we can manage the time on that. But there are other aspects that are also important. How will those platforms affect the way we replicate an office environment? Leonidas, you mentioned the issue of the avatars, the three-dimensional tools to interact with people. But how also those platforms will allow us to better manage the information around the value creation process that we do remotely. How can we access documents? How can we manage data, especially in those very knowledge-intensive sectors, in a way that can make it even more effective than if you are physically in the office? If you have a technological platform, a digital platform that allows you to do all that while you are interacting with people, imagine the productivity gains associated with that could be colossal. The reduction in costs of interactions, the reductions in the difficulty of accessing information, of building those networks.
But would you be employing as many people then?
But you see, that's the thing, Domna. How can we basically make sure that the network effect is there? That we access people that can be, that we can, tap into other, talent pools that we cannot do right now physically and that we could do digitally. And it's not only basically being able to access talent somewhere in the world in a different time zone or in a different part of the country. No, it's a more, let's say, a finer level of that you will be able to basically generate or reinvent the value creation process there.
Let me ask you something now. How do you ensure that you're not going to have a substitution effect then?
Well, you can't. We will have to see, and I think that's the point that you make that is very important. How can we make sure that regulation protects people and at the same time creates the conditions for that to happen? No, it's finding that balance that you mentioned, between enabling, empowering, and protecting at the same time.
However, from a regulatory point of view, if I may add, because I mentioned earlier, we're still in the learning process. Even if we pass laws, even if we try to understand the concept and regulate it from a regulatory point of view, we will always need to be adaptive. I mean, the concept of adaptive governance that was created for the environmental issues is very relevant to this one as well, because you need to be able to respond very quickly to the changes that the market and technology brings. So just by passing one law at a certain point in time does not mean that even in a year's time it will be relevant, okay, especially in these areas. So you need to combine flexibility and stability and security in public policy. You know, having a flex security in public policy regarding teleworking. And I think that we need to be prepared. The Ministry of Labor, the Ministry of Digital Governance, the Ministry of Education, everybody needs to be prepared to design and implement smart regulations that adapt very quickly to the changes.
Or even the optimal there would be to even foresee the changes.
Exactly.
Because unfortunately, the civil sector, especially in our country, there's always a time lag from the moment that you understand something to the moment that you're able to apply it regulatory in a primary, secondary legislation, then the diffusion effect into the civil service of how they're going to adapt and adopt the regulation. So this flexibility is very much needed, but at times it's needed ex ante, not just ex post. And we see this with financial regulation as well, and the difficulty of it.
So in fact, we return to the general theme of this morning, which is foresight, the importance of foresight.
We have a structure. We do have a structure for foresight in Greece, a recent one.
Yeah, of course, there was an introductory talk in the beginning. We are in rapidly changing times, and we need to look ahead, although we are conscious that we cannot predict. At the same time, we need to be constantly asking ourselves questions about the future, maybe only for the reason that this helps us destroy our convictions and help us be more flexible and less rigid in our understanding. Now, of course, there is another big question that we didn't touch upon, and I don't think, obviously, we don't have the time. It is the political consequences of this change, because it will create changes in the labor market. It will create probably unemployment in certain fields. It will create tensions, and it may influence also the political behavior. As I said, I mean, we have had the precedent of the 19th century when conditions of the location of work changed, and that brought about tremendous changes in politics. Maybe we are in front of changes in politics as well. We have 1 minute. Who wants to take the floor for a last word?
Well, my concern is also the angle. I mean, it's not really hopeful to end the panel with more questions, but I'll do it. I'll indulge. The other question is what you do with public finances, and how, especially, and I can mostly see the angle of our country, in a point in time when we manage somehow, in some regard, to tame the informal market, both tax-wise but also labor-wise. This opens up, again, a new stream, a new question, a new fear, if you want, of unregulated and untaxed employment, right? So the main control mechanism that you do have, labor inspection, for example, in order to see whether employers are paying for the employee contributions of their personnel, is again, we have again the need to rethink about it in a foresight way. How do you capture this? How do you make sure that people are being taxed, and even more so, they pay themselves and their employers their insurance contributions in order to, in a nearly viable insurance system, ensure that its viability will be continuing in the same, if not ameliorated, manner.
Two important points. I'll just finish by saying that if we need to do foresight about these things that Domna said, which are really critical and very important, Delphi is the place to do it. So.
Okay, well, our time is up. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.